Hey everyone, welcome back to the Building Bigger Lives podcast. I'm Michael Regan, along with Kathryn Peterson, and we're excited today to bring you a topic that I think most of us understand very well. It's going to be a topic around goals, and we're going to try to look at both sides of the story, how we set those goals, and then how we handle things when things don't go exactly as we had hoped or planned. So before I get into the weeds on this one, let me bring my friend Kathryn into the screen. Kathryn, how are you doing today? Great to be with you as always.
Great to see you, Michael. I
All
love
right.
this topic. Goals. Yay.
Well, it's one that I think you personally have some great experience with. So maybe I'll start the first question with you. How do you think most producers, those of us in sales-oriented roles, which are responsible for kicking a lot of productivity into what ultimately becomes profitability, all that starts with some version of prep and planning and goal setting. So tell me how you think most producers these days are getting that process started. How do they set their big goals?
Yeah, for us, I feel like most originators and real estate agents are on annual. And but I think a lot of people will set both the annual goal and also quarterly. And hopefully they do, because I think it's been helpful for me right now to break them up a little bit more. But I think one thing that we're all struggling with is how to set goals in a down market, which has been really interesting to talk about with people because it's a little different than I always just want to grow and do more than last year when you have market forces that aren't participating in that plan. So it's been a little bit of a stranger time to set goals than it has been in the past.
So do you set some anchor points toward more familiar territory in the past, or is that too difficult to do given that every season has its own unique factors? I mean, how exactly do you do that given that, to your point, we are not exactly in familiar territory? These are definitely economic uncharted waters.
Yeah, I think it's been, yes, you have to set production goals because that's what, the company wants in one way, shape, or form. And I think they're still good to have. But I know that a lot of us, and I know from your instruction as well, we've been focusing on what we're doing every day. So more activity goals versus outcome. So output versus outcome is a little different. And really, okay, how many calls am I going to make? How many proactive events am I going to do? Am I going to do realtor pop-bys? What does that look like in a week, in a day, in a month? And so it's just focusing in on the activities so that hopefully that does drive the outcomes. But at the same time, there's so many things that we just can't control in this business, and that's okay.
Okay, I think you're tipping into one of my favorite topics, so I'll get into nerdy coach mode here. So once those goals are set as somewhat of a orientation toward the direction that we're heading, what you're talking about are breaking down some of those objectives into disciplines and into projects, and so I see both of those as really crucial to the whole process of making sure that this plan has the momentum that it needs in order to move toward those goals. Disciplines are going to be defined by the things we commit to do on a consistent basis. These are going to be the things that we do that are routines that we commit to with ourselves first, with our team second, and sometimes an accountability partner at some point. Those are a little different than projects that we set. Those are areas of improvement that have more of a completion date. There's a certain time frame in which those are finished, and often they're critical in order to achieve the goal, just like a discipline. But because they're time-based versus routine-based, I like to separate those when we're breaking down those goals into those daily habits, because it helps us see which of these are going to have time in your time block on a regular basis versus which just need time to knock them out and get them done. How's your team done as we've separated those between those routines, the disciplines and the projects?
Yeah, so I'm going to give a few examples because I think that this is difficult for people. So one example is a discipline or a project might be, hey, I want to add a continuing education class to my list of continuing education classes. And that means I have to write it, get it submitted to the state, do all that stuff that gets it kind of launched. But then a discipline may be, hey, I'm going to have one of those CE classes every month. And I'm going to send an email to 8 people to tell them about the classes that we do, or I might make 5 calls to remind people to go. Things like that are more daily disciplines versus the project.
That's a really good example. Yeah, I like to tell people, let's do one on the personal side as well, because sometimes it's easier for us to do this in our business because we're so focused on this, but it also works in your personal life. Let's say you set a health goal, and let's say that health goal is you're going to run a 5K for Labor Day this year, and so you got to get yourself ready for that. And so for some folks, that discipline, of course, is going to involve the daily routine of getting off the couch, moving. Might start with walking, might start with jogging, eventually get to a pace of running that you can handle. But the project or the improvement that you might need to commit to as part of that goal is, I've got to sign up for the race. That's a deadline.
Mhm.
I've got to buy the right shoes. That's critical. So some of these things work on the personal side as well, and it's really important for people to see that both contribute toward meeting your overall goals.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes you just have those things that you're like, I've been meaning to do that forever. And those are great to put on the project list because I think that sometimes just accomplishing a project can be so motivating to keep you going on the other things like the daily disciplines that get kind of monotonous. It's like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I finally cleaned out my desk drawer that I've been meaning to do forever.
Yeah, great point. There are sometimes things that are ancillary to our overall mindset, and if those things are, pesky, my friend Bill Hart used to like to call those a rock in his shoe. And sometimes you just need to get the rock out of your shoe so you can get back to what you're doing. All right, so one of the books that we read a few years ago was Atomic Habits, and one of my favorite quotes out of it was this idea that we don't, as productive people, we don't tend to rise to the level of our goals as much as we tend to fall to the level of our systems. And I remember that quote really forced me to embrace this idea that while goal setting is important in terms of orientation, systems are really the foundation of our success if we're going to meet our goals. How have you worked systems into your process once you've set a goal, once you've committed to those disciplines, you've blocked out your calendar for the project time? Now we need a system to keep that machine rolling. How have you done that, or how have you seen others do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, I'm a big believer in systems. I'm kind of half an ops person, really. So for me, it's some tools like Win by Noon, for example, that our friend Todd does has been great for myself and a lot of people. And that's just, it kind of keeps track of everything that you do in a day so that you know, oh, am I actually getting done what I need to do today? And am I accomplishing what I need to by noon, which is when we're most productive? But also some things like, hey, how am I keeping track of those things that I need to do every day so it's in front of my brain and I don't forget? Because I can say, oh, I'm going to journal every day or work out 3 times a week. But if you don't have something to track that, that's difficult. So that's why certain apps like workout apps will have those charts so you can see exactly where you're at and where your minutes are at and where things are at. So it's no different than wearing a pedometer. You can really track what you're doing and having those systems in place. There's so many you can use, but it does really help. Even just a calendar on the wall with a check mark can be huge.
Yeah, you nailed it with that last one. I think so many people do get a little bit mentally, I don't know. They hit a mental wall of, oh my gosh, I don't know how to use the app. That's too much to do. And so that becomes an excuse for why they
Yeah.
maybe don't do tracking. But you're right. Sometimes our simple, desktop calendar, an Outlook calendar, those are great tools to get started because you already know how to use them. They're very basic. You mentioned the Win by Noon journal. That's a great holographic tool, one where you write with pen and paper. But others are now apps. I know you're a big fan of Monday as a tool to keep track of some of your project work, at least. And then, on a personal side, I've seen people use things like My Net Diary to keep track of what they're
Mm.
eating every day as they've set some of their health goals. There's so many things out there, and we can definitely unpack that in another episode if somebody wants to get more into the deeper tips around which systems really work,
Mhm.
how do they work, why do we choose one over another. But for today, I think we'll keep it at a high level and say systems are going to be critical, because setting a goal without a system means that you have no real personal accountability to what you said you would do. So how is it that we handle things once we get going and we run into what we think are reasons why maybe our routines aren't happening, but they might be excuses. How do we know how to handle things when they don't go exactly as we had planned?
Well, I think it's first evaluating things like, hey, I'm not first, it's kind of the awareness of, hey, I'm not actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Cause sometimes you have to kind of realize that, like, oh my gosh, I totally spaced that goal. And then it's kind of saying, why am I not doing it? Is it that I'm not being reminded to do it? Is it that I really didn't want that as a goal? Is it that it's scary in some sort of way, or I need a different skill to be able to do that? So I think it's sitting down and kind of going through it with yourself of, hey, what's blocking me from getting this piece done? And then it's also not blaming yourself. So you kind of have to say, okay, that was yesterday. Yesterday wasn't a good day, but today is going to be a different day. And I'm going to accomplish what I need to do today, because I think people are like, oh, I broke my 10-day streak and now I'm just never working out again. So you have to be careful with how you judge yourself and say, hey, it's a new day today. It's okay that I made one phone call all day yesterday, but today I'm going to rock my goals. And it's not that I now have to do twice the number of calls, but I'm going to at least hit what I need to do today.
So good. You touched on a couple of things there I just want to highlight because they're really important. And if people miss them, I want them to maybe see something practical. One of the things you and I do is we create a simple one-page plan. Mine looks a
Mhm.
little bit like this. You probably have one as well.
Yep.
You noticed I just
Right
grabbed
next to
that
me.
right off my desk as well. And that's part of the key is if it's right there, then it's visible. It's amazing how your integrity does a great job of keeping you on track when you have to look at something every day that you wrote in your own words and you
Mhm.
have to decide, am I going to do what I said I would do today? That's a huge component. It by itself, it won't always work, but it's such a fundamental truth. Another thing that you mentioned were things we control and don't control. So one of the things I'll sometimes do with someone that's struggling with keeping up the pace is I'll have them take out a piece of paper and draw three simple columns. And in the first column, we'll write down in their plan all the things you control based on what goals you set. Then all of the things that you can influence. You may not control them, but you have a high degree of influence over what happens next. In that third column, I used to use don't control, but the truth is I felt like that had such a fatalistic angle to it. Like, well, if I don't control it, what am I going to do? I had that kind of attitude. So I decided to say, these are the things I accept. So it's a CIA, control, influence, and accept. And once I've really worked through that column, it does help me separate reasons from excuses. And I find that I'm much more motivated to do exactly what you said. Is if I had a bad day or things just got off track, I can look at that column and say, okay, I guess I didn't have control over that. I have to accept that that happened and
Mhm.
not use it as an excuse to not get right back to where I said I would go. So great little tips in your little vignette there. So I'm
Mhm.
glad we caught a couple of those.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what I think of is um, when I had COVID, I couldn't work out, right? And it's so easy to get off track at that point because it can take a little while to, build back up. And it's like, oh, I'm not going to PR. I'm not going to do my best. And you have to say, okay, I had that. It's done. Now what can I do to build back up to where I was versus just be like, okay, I just can't do it anymore. So
Yeah, those of you who missed that, PR, personal record. Yeah, got it.
thank you.
Oh, good. Yeah, I do the same. Kathryn will have to catch me, folks. I am known for a good sports analogy here and there, and she does remind me. Not everyone knows your little baseball phrases, so we'll keep each other accountable. So let's talk about game film, Kathryn, because sometimes we have to take stock. We have to, I know in Win by Noon at the end of the week. You do a weekly total. At the end of the month, you do a monthly total. And then at the end of the quarter, we do a deep dive evaluation. You and I work closely together, but not everybody has a coach. How do we break down that game film? Who's the person helpful to you that's outside of all of your reasons and excuses that really helps you break that down? What are some ways you've seen effective when someone has said, okay, I've really got to take all that tracking and break it down to decide how I scored, how I did, and what I'll do next?
Well, of course, there's yourself, and are you accountable to yourself? And that can be helpful to say, wow, last month I made, you know, 102 calls, and this month I made 50 calls. What's that going to do? I need to step it up because I felt like I did a lot, but I apparently didn't. But really, what's the most effective is if you have anybody else to go through those goals with. So that could be your manager, that could be a coworker, that could be your husband, that could be somebody in your life that you can just say, "Hey, this is where I am with my goals. How did you meet your goals, and what happened with yours?" So I think we have to do something where I am, where once a week we have to say how we did with loan starts, how we did with apps, that kind of stuff. And it can be really, really important to say, ooh, that kind of looks a little ugly. I don't want to have to put that number down again next week.
Yeah, that's good. So having someone have just that visibility alone can be helpful. Breaking down the game film is hard though. That's when, hey, I did all the reps. I did what I said I would
Mhm.
do, and I'm still not getting the results. Um, what am I doing wrong? What's happening? Um, I've found that that's maybe one of the most critical roles I get invited to play as a coach, is to help someone dig into the real story behind the story, because not
Mhm.
everybody just gets results by doing their reps. Sometimes we find out that, oh, it's not that you're not making those calls, it's what you're talking a lot instead of asking a lot of questions, or you're not a really good active listener. When they're giving you a response, you're just moving on to your next talking point instead of exploring their answer a little bit to demonstrate that you heard them and that they can trust you. So there are things that we do need to do from time to time. How often are you evaluating? Because that's a question I get a lot is, okay, well, let's say I need to make some changes. Are we changing things daily or weekly or monthly? Like, how regularly is changing your system or your process
Mhm.
really helpful?
I think it depends a little bit on the time. So for me, I'll look at things weekly and say, "Hey, did I get through my list? What did that look like?" So I might do a quick evaluation of myself because honestly, if I'm off track for 4 weeks, that's going to mess up like the whole year. So I think you have to evaluate it, total it every day even is best if you can do that, but at least if you're looking at things once a week before things really get off track, but then on a monthly basis, maybe taking that deeper dive to say, "Hey, let's look at this compared to January last year. Let's look at this compared to June of last year. Hey, what other things can I do to tweak for next month in my plan? Or what other things I have these projects for the quarter, but I only got to this point. What do I need to do to step it up so I'm done with that project by the end of the quarter?" So I think it depends a little bit on where you are with projects and goals as far as how deep you dive, and how big that project is. I mean, I think there's some things where you've got to stay on it day by day, or you're just not going to get there.
Well, we won't get into the weeds in today's podcast, but you just hit a couple of really important notes. So I'll just highlight them, and then we can come back, or we can talk about them in the show notes below as folks have questions. One of the things you said is, if I wait 4 weeks before I make adjustments on something that I'm doing that's not working, that can really throw off the cadence of my whole year. And I think most of our listeners can understand that. One of the reasons we developed a cadence of talking about every 2 weeks was for that purpose. It's not to say that we should change things every 2 weeks, but we should check in. We should evaluate. And if the answer on a 2 week check in is, I'm doing what I said I would do, I'm tracking with where I said I would track, then of course we're not as likely to look for changes as we are for obstacles. Okay, what in the 2 weeks ahead then could be an obstacle for you to keep up your pace? Is there anything we need to look at to rethink or to adjust based on what's coming so you can keep up your pace?
Mhm.
Conversely, if you're struggling in those 2 weeks, it's fair to ask, well, is it a cadence issue? Like, did you do it on the daily routine you said? Or is there something more fundamental there? Something related to how you're doing it. That's the harder call, but those things need to happen. And then as we look out at your projects, you said some of those could be bigger. They could take longer to do. So one of the things we really work on in our projects is setting stage gates for that very purpose. Because if all we do is set a project end date and there's nothing between the day we set it and the day we need to deliver it, it ends up looking a lot like we all felt back in college when we were cramming for some sort of, final exam. And that's not a very effective way to do our project work. Better with some of those more hefty projects to break them down into stage gates so that there's a sense of, okay, if I'm going to do that by the end of March, what level of progress would I measure by the end of January, by the end of February, so that we have some evidence that you're moving toward that goal at a measured clip. So we talked about reasons and excuses, and I don't want to bring that back again for any other reason other than to remind folks that if you're getting behind on those stage gates, or if you're just not getting the results every 2 weeks that you expected, be patient with yourself and look for, where am I making an excuse when perhaps there was a real reason? You referenced COVID earlier. Most of us, if we get COVID or some kind of illness, need to be realistic and say, I have to adjust my goals in a season like that. It's not realistic to think I'm going to go running 5 miles a day with COVID. So maybe that's a reason.
Mhm.
That's not an excuse. And if you're struggling with that self-evaluation, man, is it helpful to have somebody else, like you said, a spouse, a coworker, a teammate, just a friend. Doesn't always have to be a coach, someone that can come alongside you and say, hey, that sounds like you're really hard on yourself. Maybe you just need to breathe deeply and get back at it tomorrow. So thank you for breaking those down. Those are really good.
And one other thing to bring up, which I think a lot of us have dealt with this year, is goals and ego and kind of how they're tied. Like, are we setting a goal because that's kind of feeding what we need? Like, hey,
Mhm.
I have to be in the top, whatever, I have to be this, or is it what we truly want? And I think that's a really difficult question when we set goals and when we go off track is, hey, am I setting this goal for the reason that I need to? And do I need that to keep motivated? I get that as well. So it's kind of one of those questions to think about and ask yourself is, really, what are the parts that get me excited? And am I setting this goal for that reason or that reason? And that can help them stay on track or get off track.
Yeah, really good. Really good. All right. Well, let's bring this one into a close with just a couple of takeaways for our audience, because I know that's always important that they feel like we're not just highlighting examples, that we're giving them some practical takeaways.
Mhm.
One of the things I would suggest, if you're seeking accountability, and let's say you don't have a formal relationship either with a coach or a manager where there's a little more of a defined boundary to that. Let's say you've sought it from a friend, or a coworker, or even a spouse, where that could get a little clunky. Here's a tip on healthy accountability. Make sure that you focus with each other on the commitments that you make to yourself first, because commitments really avoid the other person assuming a role of playing the heavy where maybe that wasn't what the accountability was about.
Mhm.
A good clue for that, if that's happening, is if the person you think is holding you accountable spends a lot of time shoulding all over you. Kathryn, you should have done this. Well, you shouldn't have done that. That's a pretty good clue that you maybe didn't establish your commitments in a clear way up front. And now you've
Mhm.
given them the liberty to start telling you where you should and shouldn't operate. And that usually doesn't end up in very healthy accountability. Now we end up in some sort of adversarial situation. And we've all
Mhm.
felt that at some point. And so that's just a good clue for me if that's happening of, oh, got it. I didn't make my commitments clear with them from the get-go. How about you, Kathryn? Any great tips or best practices around routines before we tie out that you'd want to share with our group?
I think that first, you have to set goals because that's going to be the most important thing. Even if you just do that and look at them every day, that's going to make a difference for you. So I think that that's really the key is get something down and have it somewhere that you can see it. The other thing just to bring up, we do have a whole episode that we've recorded on accountability partners and how to find one. So listen to that if you haven't already.
Great, great. Kathryn, a lot of things we'll get to talk about as the year goes on. And I think what's going to be great is you really hit it in the way that we approach goals. They do need some checkpoints. And so let's check back with our audience as the year progresses. Let's talk about some of these practical things we laid out today and then put them in real time, because I think we will both be doing that very thing. And I'd like to make sure that those of you who've tuned in to follow us get to see how that happens. So maybe you can take that back with your accountability partner, make those healthy adjustments, and hit the goals that you set for this year, both personally and professionally. Listen, thanks for tuning in today. We're the Building Bigger Lives podcast. We're going to be here regularly with new episodes. We invite you to follow along, so please do make sure to click the like button and share our episodes with those that you think might benefit from what we're talking about in the real estate and or mortgage lending communities, because we do believe that those folks are really dear to our hearts, and we want to help as many of them as we can. And we look forward to seeing you on an episode very soon. Thanks for tuning in today.